It was right around dusk when the young woman pulled up her steps at the wooden gate leading into the isolated homestead, her body heavy with the burden of a 7-month pregnancy and a battered leather suitcase hanging from her weary grip. She knew no one in these parts, had nowhere left to run, and asked only for a simple plate of warm food before carrying her heavy feet further down the dusty road. On the other side of the weathered fence stood a widow with a hardened heart, a woman who had not let a single soul pass through her front door in decades, and carried the solitary key to a back bedroom that had remained locked since a quiet tragedy long ago. What neither of them could have possibly imagined in that quiet evening hour was how deeply that soft knock upon the wooden fence post was about to unearth a painful past that the old woman had spent more than 30 years trying to bury under the silence of the countryside. Nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural Tennessee, there was a small farm that everyone in the county knew by name, though almost no one ever took the long dirt driveway to visit. It sat at the end of a winding back road where the telephone poles grew sparse, surrounded by open pastures and ancient white oak trees that provided the only real shade for the cattle during the brutal heat of mid-July afternoons. The farmhouse itself was a white clapboard building, simple, sturdy, and meticulously maintained, featuring a wide front porch with cedar posts where a cool breeze would occasionally stir the air as the sun began to dip below the tree line. Anyone looking at the property from the highway might have imagined a bustling family inside, full of noisy children, clattering dishes, and the cheerful chaos of daily farm life. Yet anyone who walked up to the steps was immediately met by an old, heavy silence. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when there are no longer enough voices left inside to make it feel alive. The owner of that quiet homestead was a woman named Eleanor Vance, a 64-year-old widow with silver hair pinned tightly into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and the calloused, unwavering hands of someone who had spent her entire life working the soil. Across the small township of Willow Creek, she was known as a woman of extremely few words, the sort of person who answered greeting with a nod and avoided standing around to talk near the feed store after Sunday services. No one in town ever called her mean, because she had never done a cruel thing to a neighbor in her entire life, but she was closed off like a storm cellar door that had been rusted shut for so long that people forgot what was stored inside. In many ways, that was precisely what had happened to Eleanor's inner world after decades of choosing self-preservation over the risk of caring for another human being. By all local standards, the Vance farm was a prosperous piece of land, boasting 30 acres of rich bottomland that yielded good hay, a healthy herd of Angus cattle, and a life of modest financial security that many families in the valley struggled to achieve. There was never a shortage of fresh milk in her icebox, nor fresh eggs from the coop, nor sweet peaches from the small orchard behind the barn when late summer rolled around, but abundance loses its taste when there is no one sitting across the table to share it with. Every evening, Eleanor would look at the long pine dining table built by her grandfather, a table designed to seat 8 people comfortably, and see only one wooden chair pulled out, the one she had sat in every night for 20 years. She saw a pantry stocked to the ceiling with home-canned tomatoes and blackberry jam. Yet her heart remained as empty as the quiet hallways, and she had long since stopped believing that anything in her routine would ever change before her own time was up. At the very back of the hallway sat a small bedroom that no living soul had entered in more than 32 years, its heavy oak door remaining shut tight against the drafty house. The dark iron key to that room did not hang on the brass hook by the back door, but was instead stitched securely into the inner lining of Eleanor's heavy canvas apron pocket by a piece of faded red ribbon. She carried that key with her every single day, feeling its cold weight press against her hip as she swept the porch or tended the garden, never using it, yet unable to bring herself to snip the thread and set it down. The few older folks in Willow Creek who remembered the tragedy of her youth never brought it up out of respect for her privacy, while the younger farmhands who passed by on tractors simply assumed the stern widow preferred her privacy above all else. Eleanor's husband, Thomas, had passed away 12 years prior, taken slowly by a lingering lung illness that gradually sapped his strength through one of the coldest winters the Cumberland Plateau had ever seen. After Thomas was buried in the churchyard down the road, the house seemed to shrink around Eleanor, growing colder and quieter with each passing season. She continued to run the farm with the same stubborn discipline he had admired in her, rising before dawn to milk the cows, feed the flock, and mend the wire fences, but her actions were driven entirely by routine rather than joy. Her heart had become a dark, locked room of its own, a place where she refused to step, having learned long ago that it was far safer to ask nothing of the world than to open her arms to another person and face the unbearable pain of losing them all over again. It was on a warm Thursday evening beneath an amber sky, one of those quiet southern summer sunsets where the light seems to hang suspended in the dust above the dirt road, that Eleanor's carefully guarded world began to shift without her permission. She was gathering the last of the white cotton sheets off the clothesline behind the house when the faint sound of a woman's voice carried over the sound of the crickets, calling out from the front gate near the mail post. Visitors were practically unheard of on her stretch of road, especially at that hour, and Eleanor paused with a wooden clothespin still held between her fingers to listen carefully. The voice called out a second time, polite, timid, and trembling slightly with hesitation, the sound of someone who was terribly afraid of causing an intrusion, but had nowhere else left to turn. Eleanor placed the folded laundry into her woven basket, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked around the corner of the house with slow, deliberate steps to see who was standing at her fence line. Leaning heavily against the weathered wooden gate-post was a young woman Eleanor had never seen before in her life, a girl who could not have been more than 22 years old. Her dark hair was gathered into a messy bun that was coming undone from days of travel, with soft strands clinging to her perspiration-stained forehead, and she wore a faded floral print dress that was covered in fine road dust from the highway. Over her slumped shoulders, despite the evening warmth, she had pulled a hand-knit caramel-colored wool shawl, frayed at the edges but kept with obvious care, and at her feet sat an old brown leather suitcase that looked far too heavy for her slender frame. Most striking of all was the high, distinct curve of her belly beneath the thin cotton dress, revealing a pregnancy so far along that she appeared ready to give birth within a matter of weeks. Before Eleanor could even ask her purpose, the young woman began apologizing in a low, exhausted voice, as if she were deeply ashamed of her own presence on the property. She explained that she had been walking along the state highway for days, that she didn't know a single soul in the entire state of Tennessee, and asked in little more than a whisper if the lady of the house might have a spare piece of cornbread or a cold glass of water to spare for a passing stranger. She introduced herself simply as Clara, promising that she didn't mean to be a burden, that she would sit right there on the grass to eat whatever scrap was offered, and would carry on down the road immediately afterward. There was a profound, soul-deep exhaustion in Clara's brown eyes that went far beyond the physical soreness of walking miles in worn shoes, a quiet desperation that Eleanor recognized instantly despite having never met the girl before. Clara had been on the move for nearly a week, sleeping in abandoned barns when night caught her in the open countryside, and accepting rides in the back of pickup trucks whenever a merciful driver took pity on her condition. She had left her home in the middle of a rainy night while her family slept, packing only 3 changes of clothes, a small envelope of pocket money, and her late mother's wool shawl. Every single mile along the asphalt felt twice as long under the increasing weight of the child she carried, and more than once she had sat down on the gravel shoulder believing she could not take another step forward. Yet every time her courage failed her, she felt the small, rhythmic kick against her ribs, reminding her that she was carrying another life besides her own, a little heart that depended entirely on her refusal to give up. Eleanor stood motionless on the gravel walk, staring at the sight before her as her immediate instinct screamed at her to close her heart tight, the same way a person instinctively clenches a fist when braced for a blow. She did not want to get involved in the messy affairs of a stranger, having spent 3 decades building a quiet, predictable life centered on keeping the outside world at a safe distance from her porch. The last thing her peaceful homestead needed was an unwed, penniless girl bringing her complications into the house, especially since that pregnant belly was the exact physical reminder of a grief Eleanor had spent her adult life trying to ignore. Yet deeper than her fear was a foundational belief that had been drilled into her during her upbringing in the hills. A simple mountain faith that insisted no traveler was ever brought to a person's gate purely by accident. Eleanor looked again at Clara's dusty face, taking in the swollen ankles spilling over the edges of her scuffed leather shoes, and heard a quiet memory from her own youth reminding her that it was a sin against God to turn away a hungry, homeless child at sundown. No matter how many deadbolts she had installed on her emotions over the years, Eleanor could not bring herself to utter the words that would send the exhausted girl back out onto the dark highway. Without offering a long speech, because grand declarations had never been her way, Eleanor reached out, lifted the heavy iron latch, and pushed the gate open, making a subtle motion with her head toward the porch. She remarked gruffly that no one had ever been turned away from the Vance farm with an empty stomach, and that, thankfully, plain food was one thing she always had plenty of in her kitchen. Clara's eyes welled with sudden, silent tears of overwhelming relief as she picked up her heavy suitcase and followed the older woman up the wooden steps, her shoes dragging softly against the porch boards as they stepped into the quiet house together. Inside the warm kitchen, illuminated by the soft amber light of the oil lamp hanging above the sink, Eleanor set to work without asking unnecessary questions, heating up a skillet of leftover pinto beans, slicing a thick piece of salt pork, and placing a square of buttermilk cornbread on a blue tin plate. Clara ate with slow, careful bites, trying her best to hide her ravenous hunger out of politeness, though her body betrayed her after days of living on meager road snacks. Between bites, as the warmth of the room began to settle into her chilled bones, the young girl began to share tiny pieces of her story, speaking in quiet fragments because certain heartbreaks can only be told a little bit at a time. She explained that she had traveled all the way from a small coal mining town in eastern Kentucky, leaving behind the only valley she had ever known because there was simply no place left for her to exist there safely. As the girl ate, Eleanor stood near the wood stove, with her back partially turned, sipping a cup of chicory coffee while monitoring the guest out of the corner of her eye. It had been years since another human being had sat at that pine table, and the simple sounds of Clara's spoon tapping against the tin plate and her soft breathing filled the house with a presence that felt both profoundly disruptive and strangely comforting to the old widow. Part of Eleanor wanted nothing more than for the girl to finish her meal and be on her way, so the house could return to its safe, predictable silence before any old wounds could be reopened. Yet another part of her, a buried part she was terrified to acknowledge, found itself leaning into the rare warmth of having another living soul sitting beneath her roof as the night settled over the farm. The few details Clara shared that first evening were more than enough to heavy the heart of anyone who listened, revealing that her mother had passed away from an illness when Clara was just 12 years old. Following her mother's death, her father, a stern, unyielding railroad worker named Silas, had grown bitter and harsh, caring far more about his reputation among the church elders than the emotional well-being of his only daughter. When Clara discovered she was expecting a child out of wedlock, Silas did not offer a hand of comfort or guidance, but instead declared that she had brought irreversible shame upon his house, and demanded she surrender the infant the moment it was born. As for the young man responsible, a local mechanic's apprentice named William, he had packed his bags and left town for Atlanta the very night he learned of the pregnancy, fleeing his responsibilities like a coward fleeing a fire. Eleanor listened to the entire story without interrupting once, her spoon slowly stirring her dark coffee as her gaze remained fixed on the yellow flame of the lantern. She noticed how Clara kept pulling the caramel wool shawl tighter around her waist whenever she mentioned her home, her fingers tracing the crocheted edges as if holding onto a lifeline from the past. Sensing the old woman's quiet observation, Clara offered a small, sad smile and explained that the shawl had belonged to her mother, Sarah, and was the single item of value she had taken from her bedroom when she slipped out into the midnight rain. It was her only physical connection to a time in her life when she had been loved, held, and protected from the harshness of the world. Eleanor said nothing in response, but deep in her chest, a sharp, familiar ache flared up, one she had not felt with such intensity in more than 30 years. She, too, knew the agonizing weight of waiting for a child, of dreaming about the soft cries that would fill a quiet nursery, of imagining the tiny fingers, the warm baby scent, and the immense responsibility of holding a new life in her arms. She knew better than anyone in the county what it felt like to watch those precious dreams crumble into dust before they could ever take root in the real world. That was precisely why Clara's heavy abdomen was so difficult for Eleanor to look at. It was a living, breathing mirror of the exact happiness she had once almost possessed, only to have it ripped away by an unforgiving providence. When the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 8 in the evening, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, Eleanor made a sudden decision that caught even herself by surprise. She cleared her throat and informed the young woman in a brisk, matter-of-fact tone that no pregnant girl was going to sleep in a ditch on her watch, especially with rain clouds gathering over the ridge, and that there was a small daybed in the utility room off the back porch where she could stay the night. She spoke with a deliberate sharpness, keeping her posture stiff so as not to appear soft or welcoming, because allowed herself to feel affection was the one boundary she was determined never to cross again. Clara thanked her profusely, her eyes shining with immense gratitude, but Eleanor merely brushed off the thanks with a wave of her hand, remarking that gratitude was best saved for times when it was actually earned. That night, lying beneath her heavy hand-quilted blankets in her own dark bedroom, Eleanor found herself entirely unable to sleep, as the old timbers of the house creaked in the night wind. She lay awake for hours staring at the faint plaster cracks on the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sound of soft footsteps moving in the back room whenever Clara shifted in her sleep. Across the hallway, behind a wall she had kept guarded for 3 decades, slept a young life waiting to enter the world, bringing with it a storm of memories Eleanor had tried so hard to forget. Without realizing it, Eleanor was lying in the middle of a destiny that had been quietly arranging itself for months, waiting for a desperate knock on a wooden gate to awaken a home that had been frozen in time. The initial days the two women shared under the same roof were defined by a careful, guarded silence as they adjusted to each other's presence. Eleanor continued to rise before the first light of dawn, tending to her daily chores with her usual rigid discipline, consciously avoiding long interactions with the young guest whenever possible. It was not out of malice or cruelty, a fact that Clara quickly came to understand, but rather the defense mechanism of an elderly woman who had simply forgotten how to share her domestic space with another human being. Clara, for her part, made a conscious effort to make herself as invisible as possible, sweeping the back porch, washing her own dishes immediately after eating, and keeping her small suitcase neatly packed in the corner of the back room. Gradually, without either of them explicitly discussing it, a quiet and unspoken routine began to develop between the unlikely pair as the summer days rolled on. Every morning at 7 o'clock, they sat across from each other at the large pine table to drink their morning coffee, exchanging brief remarks about the humidity, the garden crops, or the price of feed down at the mill. In the afternoons, while Eleanor worked in the vegetable patch hoeing rows of butter beans, Clara would sit on a wooden stool near the open kitchen window, mending work shirts or darning socks with slow, painstaking care. These brief, simple interactions were entirely devoid of grand emotional displays, yet beneath the surface, they were weaving a subtle bond between two solitary souls who had both been discarded by the circumstances of their lives. One Tuesday morning, Clara walked down to the barn barefoot, offering to help carry the heavy tin milk pails back up to the spring house. But Eleanor shut down the offer immediately with a harsh shake of her head. She barked that a girl in her delicate condition had no business lifting metal pails or walking through muddy barnyards, telling her in no uncertain terms that her only job was to keep herself healthy and sit in the shade. Clara pulled back instantly, lowering her head with a soft apology, which caused Eleanor to feel a sudden pang of quiet regret for speaking so harshly to a girl who had only offered out of kindness. That tiny moment of self-reproach was another subtle sign that the thick ice surrounding Eleanor's heart was beginning to thin, despite her best efforts to keep it frozen solid. Despite her stern exterior, Eleanor found herself constantly monitoring the girl's well-being from a distance, noticing small details that she would have preferred to ignore. She noticed how Clara would rest her hand on the small of her back when she stood up too quickly, how she hesitated before taking the last biscuit on the plate, and how she spoke to the unborn baby in soft, musical whispers whenever she believed she was entirely alone in the house. One afternoon, while walking down the narrow hallway, Eleanor overheard Clara talking to her belly, promising the child that no matter how hard things became, she would find a way to build a real home for them, that there would be plenty of love, and that they would somehow make it through together. Listening to that fierce maternal devotion coming from such a fragile, frightened young girl caused Eleanor to lean against the doorframe in the dark, her chest tightening as tears stung her eyes for the first time in years. During those quiet summer nights, while lying awake on her narrow daybed, Clara was often haunted by vivid memories of the night she had fled her father's house in Kentucky. She remembered Silas's booming voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls of their living room as he called her a disgrace to her family name, insisting that the only proper course of action was to hand the newborn over to a wealthy couple from Lexington who had offered to pay all her medical expenses in exchange for complete secrecy and total surrender of her rights. She remembered the sheer terror of packing her small leather bag by candlelight, sneaking out through the kitchen door into the cold night rain, and running toward the main road before the morning train whistle could sound. She had not merely run away from a house. She had fled a prearranged fate that would have stripped her of her child and left her soul completely hollowed out. By the second week of Clara's stay, a heavy summer thunderhead rolled in over the mountains, bringing with it a dark afternoon sky and a torrent of rain that pounded against the tin roof of the farmhouse. The wind blew so hard that the old glass window panes rattled in their wooden frames, and bright flashes of lightning illuminated the darkening kitchen every few minutes. Eleanor was walking through the house, securing the window latches, when she found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with her legs pulled up onto the chair rung, wrapped tightly in her mother's wool shawl, flinching at every loud rumble of thunder that shook the floorboards. Realizing the girl was genuinely terrified of the storm, Eleanor set down her rag, pulled out a chair across from her, and sat down in silence to keep her company through the worst of the squall. It was the rhythmic sound of the heavy downpour pouring off the porch eaves that finally loosened Clara's tongue that afternoon, causing her to speak open-hearted words she had kept bottled up for months. In a low, faltering voice, she admitted her greatest fear to the older woman. Not the fear of her father finding her, nor the fear of living in poverty, but the terrifying dread that she was fundamentally unqualified to be a good mother. She wept quietly as she questioned whether it was selfish to bring a child into the world when she had no money, no home of her own, and no husband to help share the burden. She admitted that during her long walks along the highway, she had repeatedly wondered if her father had been right after all, if a penniless girl without a family name had any right to raise a child on her own. Eleanor sat perfectly still, watching the rainwater run down the windowpane, feeling Clara's words sink straight down into the deep well of grief she had spent half her life guarding. When she finally spoke, her voice was raspy and unaccustomed to sharing personal truths, sounding different than anything Clara had heard from her before. For the first time in over 30 years, Eleanor spoke aloud of her own young motherhood, telling the girl that she too had once been a mother for a few brief hours, giving birth to a beautiful baby girl who had passed away before the sun could set on her first day of life. She revealed that she and Thomas had already chosen a name for their little girl, a name they had treasured in their hearts like a piece of fine glass, a name that had never been spoken aloud in that house again, the name Rose. Clara sat entirely motionless, stunned by the sudden depth of the old widow's tragic confession, finally understanding the profound sadness that resided behind Eleanor's guarded eyes. She realized in that moment why the sight of a pregnant girl was so painful for the older woman, and why she constantly avoided looking directly at Clara's growing stomach. Clara's mind flashed briefly to the locked oak door at the end of the hall, connecting the dark iron key on Eleanor's apron to the memory of the baby girl who had slipped away so long ago. Yet, out of deep respect for the older woman's privacy, Clara chose not to ask about the room, knowing that some losses are so vast that they must be approached with extraordinary gentleness. Eleanor's tears fell freely now, washing away the stubborn stoicism she had maintained like armor for 3 decades, as she confessed how much love she had kept locked inside her chest all these years. She explained that the hardest part of surviving such a loss was not just the grief itself, but having an endless ocean of maternal affection with nowhere for it to go, like a freshwater spring trapped beneath heavy rock with no river to feed. That afternoon, beneath the sound of the thunder, 2 women who had been broken by life in entirely different ways found a quiet meeting place in their shared understanding of sorrow. They did not hug or make grand promises, for neither was built for dramatic gestures, but as the storm began to pass, an unbreakable thread of mutual understanding was tied firmly between them. In the weeks that followed that rainy afternoon, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse softened significantly, as if a long winter had finally released its grip on the household. Eleanor began to treat Clara not as a temporary guest who needed shelter, but with the quiet, vigilant tenderness a mother shows her own daughter. She ladled extra stew onto Clara's plate at supper, left an extra wool blanket at the foot of her bed on chilly nights, and spent time teaching her how to bake proper buttermilk biscuits from scratch. Clara, filled with immense gratitude, looked for every possible way to contribute to the farm, looking for small tasks that would not strain her body as her due date drew closer. One bright morning, while leaning out the kitchen window to watch the swallows, Clara noticed an overgrown patch of land behind the big red barn, where several old neglected peach trees were being choked by tall weeds and thick wild briars. She asked Eleanor about the spot, and the old widow explained with a slight trace of nostalgia that it had once been a lovely little orchard planted by her husband, but that no one had maintained it since Thomas had taken sick years ago. Clara said nothing more that morning, but the image of the abandoned trees remained in her mind, seeing a strange parallel between those suffocated branches and her own life before she arrived at the farm. Over the next several days, despite Eleanor's mild protests, Clara spent her mornings sitting on a low wooden stool in the shade of the old orchard, carefully pulling away the wild vines from the trunks of the peach trees. She cleared the dead grass around their bases, watered the parched soil with a small tin watering can, and spoke softly to the branches, as if they were old friends who simply needed a little care to bear fruit again. Watching the girl from the kitchen window, Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she had forgotten existed. A quiet, blooming sense of hope that made the quiet homestead feel alive, in a way it hadn't since her youth. However, just as peace seemed to settle over the valley, a troubling rumor began to circulate through the small town of Willow Creek, brought to Eleanor's attention by the local mail carrier during his Tuesday rounds. He mentioned that an unfamiliar man from out of state had been stopping at the gas station and the feed store, asking detailed questions about a young, unmarried pregnant girl who had gone missing from a township in eastern Kentucky. The stranger claimed to represent a respectable family who was desperate to bring their daughter home, hinting that a substantial cash reward would be given to anyone who provided information leading to her whereabouts. The news caused Eleanor's blood to run cold with immediate defensive fury, though she kept her composure completely calm in front of the mailman to avoid raising suspicion. She said nothing to Clara about the rumor, determined not to inflict unnecessary panic on a girl whose baby was due at any moment, but her vigilant eyes turned constantly toward the long dirt driveway. Eleanor began keeping a close watch on the main road, listening intently for the sound of approaching engines, fully aware that the girl's past was closing in on the safe haven they had built together. The confrontation came late on a Friday afternoon, when a sleek, dark sedan turned off the county road and kicked up a cloud of white dust as it slowly approached the Vance farmhouse. Eleanor saw the car coming from a quarter-mile away, and without hesitation, she instructed Clara to go into the back bedroom, pull the shades down, and remain absolutely silent until she came to get her. Clara obeyed instantly, her heart pounding against her ribs as she recognized the dark sedan as belonging to her father's wealthy employer back in Kentucky. Eleanor straightened her canvas apron, smoothed back her gray hair, and walked down the front porch steps to meet the vehicle at the gate, her jaw set like iron. A tall, middle-aged man dressed in a sharp gray suit stepped out of the automobile, tipping his hat with a polite but cold smile that failed to reach his sharp, calculating eyes. He introduced himself as an agent hired by Mr. Silas Vance to locate his runaway daughter, speaking in smooth, rehearsed tones about the family's deep concern for the girl's welfare and the generous financial compensation available for her safe return. He looked past Eleanor towards the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the windows with an uncomfortable, intrusive intensity that made the old widow's temper flare. Eleanor stood her ground directly in front of the gate, looking the man up and down with a cold, unyielding stare that had intimidated plenty of stubborn cattle buyers over the years. She informed him in a firm, loud voice that she lived alone on her 30 acres, that she had no habit of harboring runaway strangers, and that he was currently standing on private property without an invitation. When the man attempted to press further, suggesting that an elderly woman living alone might easily be deceived by a clever girl. Eleanor stepped right up to the fence post, her hand resting heavily on the wooden rail, and told him that if he took one more step toward her porch, she would fetch her husband's 12-gauge shotgun from behind the front door and let the county sheriff settle the matter of trespass. Recognizing that he was dealing with an unyielding mountain woman who would not be bought, intimidated, or manipulated, the man's polite facade vanished, leaving behind a cold, annoyed scowl. He warned her that aiding a runaway was a foolish mistake before climbing back into his vehicle, slamming the door, and reversing down the driveway in a cloud of exhaust. Eleanor stood at the gate until the red taillights disappeared completely down the highway, her heart hammering against her ribs, before turning around to walk back into the quiet house. When she opened the bedroom door and found Clara shaking in the corner, Eleanor walked over, placed her calloused hands on the girl's shoulders, and promised her that as long as there was breath in her body, no man would ever take her or her child away from that farm. The fright of the stranger's arrival seemed to accelerate nature's timeline, and just 3 nights later, under a bright harvest moon that lit up the entire valley, Clara's labor began in earnest. The sharp, deep contractions started just after midnight, waking Clara from a deep sleep with a gasp that immediately brought Eleanor rushing into the room with a lit lamp. Eleanor took one look at the girl's tight expression and knew that this was not a false alarm. The child was determined to be born before the sun came up over the mountains. With remarkable calm, born of years of living far from town, Eleanor sent a neighboring farmhand on horseback to fetch Mrs. Martha Higgins, an experienced local midwife who had delivered half the children in the township over the past 40 years. While they waited for Martha's arrival, Eleanor kept water boiling on the stove, prepared clean cotton sheets, and held Clara's hand through each agonizing wave of pain, speaking words of encouragement that kept the young mother grounded through the worst of her labor. As the contractions grew stronger and closer together, Eleanor felt a sudden, profound shift occur within her own soul, a realization that the past could no longer be kept locked away behind wood and iron. She reached into her apron pocket, unstitched the faded red ribbon with her pocket knife, and pulled out the old iron key she had carried for 32 years. Walking down the dark hallway with steady steps, she inserted the key into the rusted lock of the back bedroom, turned it until the mechanism clicked open, and pushed the door wide for the first time since her own youth. The room was pristine, preserved like a museum of a long-ago dream, featuring a handmade wooden crib in the corner, a rocking chair near the window, and soft white curtains that stirred gently in the midnight breeze. Eleanor did not weep as she opened the windows to let the sweet night air fill the room. Instead, she felt a profound sense of peace wash over her, understanding that this room had not been preserved for a tragedy, but kept ready for a resurrection. She carried clean linens inside, made the main bed with her finest embroidered sheets, and helped Clara walk down the hall so she could give birth in the very room that had been prepared with love so many decades ago. When Martha Higgins arrived with her leather medical bag, she was surprised to find the old, locked room open and bright with lamplight. But she asked no questions, recognizing the sacred nature of what was unfolding in the house. Together, Eleanor and Martha guided Clara through the final intense hours of labor, their voices creating a chorus of strength that carried the young woman through the pain. Eleanor never let go of Clara's hand, wiping the sweat from her forehead and whispering that she was doing wonderfully, that her baby was almost here, and that a new day was about to begin for all of them. Just as the first pink light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky behind the peach orchard, a sharp, healthy cry echoed through the house, cutting through the morning quiet like a clear bell. Martha lifted the newborn, wrapped her in a warm flannel blanket, and placed her directly onto Clara's chest, announcing with a broad smile that they had a perfectly healthy baby girl. Eleanor fell to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming freely down her face. But for the first time in 32 years, they were not tears of sorrow, but tears of pure, unadulterated joy that washed away decades of lingering grief. Clara held her daughter tightly against her heart, her exhaustion instantly melting away as she looked down at the soft, dark hair and tiny fingers of her new child. She looked up at Eleanor, who was gazing at the infant with an expression of profound love, and made a decision that had been forming in her heart for weeks. In a soft, clear voice, Clara announced that her daughter's name would be Rose Eleanor Vance, named in honor of the baby who had gone before and the courageous woman who had given them both a home when they had nowhere left to go. Hearing her lost daughter's name spoken aloud over a living, healthy child caused Eleanor to weep openly, realizing that God had finally restored to her the joy she thought had been lost forever. Later that afternoon, after Martha had gone home and the house had settled into a peaceful quiet, Eleanor walked into the bedroom carrying a heavy brass key ring containing all the keys to the farm, the keys to the barn, the spring house, the tractor shed, and the front door. She placed the heavy ring into Clara's hands, declaring with a shaky but resolute voice that from this day forward, Clara was no longer a guest or a stranger, but her true daughter, and the rightful heir to every acre of the Vance homestead. She explained that everything she had worked her whole life to build now belonged to Clara and little Rose, giving her life's labor a purpose that extended far into the future. Clara wrapped the newborn Rose in her mother's caramel wool shawl, the same simple garment that had traveled with her through the dark night from Kentucky, and looked at Eleanor with deep, filial love. 3 generations of mothers, bound not by blood, but by hardship, mercy, and an unshakable love, were now united under one roof, proving that true family is often assembled by the grace of open doors and open hearts. The threat of Clara's father soon dissolved into the past, as the local community made it abundantly clear that anyone seeking to bother Eleanor Vance's family would have to answer to the entire township of Willow Creek. The years that followed passed with the sweet, effortless speed that belongs exclusively to happy homes. The neglected orchard behind the barn was fully restored by Clara and Eleanor, growing into a thriving acre of peach trees that produced hundreds of bushels of sweet fruit every summer, earning the farm a reputation for growing the finest produce in the county. The silent house that had once echoed with the solitude of a grieving widow was now constantly filled with the sound of little Rose's laughter, her pattering footsteps down the long hallway, and the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals floating through the open windows. Eleanor lived another 14 wonderful years, her silver hair softening as her heart remained completely open to the joy of watching her granddaughter grow into a bright-spirited young girl. She spent her golden years sitting on the front porch, swinging gently in the evening air, holding Rose on her lap to teach her the names of the birds, how to churn butter, and how to tend the garden with patient hands. The bitterness that had defined her middle age was entirely replaced by a gentle, glowing serenity that touched everyone who came near the farm. On a warm afternoon in late August, when little Rose was 8 years old, Eleanor sat on the wide front porch watching the young girl chase yellow butterflies through the yard, while Clara gathered fresh peaches from the orchard. The old widow looked out toward the wooden gate at the end of the dirt driveway, the very spot where a desperate, pregnant stranger had stood 14 years prior, holding a worn leather suitcase and asking for a simple plate of food. Eleanor smiled softly to herself, folded her hands in her lap, and offered a quiet prayer of thanksgiving for the mysterious, beautiful ways in which life repairs what is broken. Life, in its deep and unsearchable wisdom, rarely unfolds along the neat, predictable paths we try to carve out for ourselves when we are young. So often, we encounter terrible losses that seem to shatter our purpose, leaving us to construct walls around our hearts in a desperate effort to protect ourselves from ever feeling such agonizing pain again. We lock away our memories in dark rooms, bury our capacity for love under the heavy weight of self-preservation, and convince ourselves that it is safer to live in the quiet safety of solitude than to risk opening our doors to the unpredictable storms of the world. Yet the human heart was never designed to exist as a sealed vault. It was made to be a house with wide windows and an unlocked door, capable of receiving grace even when it feels entirely exhausted by sorrow. The true beauty of human existence lies in the quiet reality that our greatest heartbreaks do not have to be the final chapter of our lives, but can instead become the very soil from which our greatest acts of compassion grow. When we find the courage to unlatch the gates of our lives for someone who is struggling, we often discover that the mercy we extend to a stranger ends up being the very thing that saves our own soul. Family is not merely a matter of shared bloodlines or legal names written on official certificates. Real family is forged in the quiet, daily choices to stand by one another through the storms, to share our bread when times are lean, and to hold each other's burdens when the road gets too steep to walk alone. There is never a door so firmly rusted shut that love cannot find a way to turn the key, nor a life so deeply broken by tragedy that it cannot be made whole again through the simple, transformative power of human kindness. The unexpected visitors who arrive at our doors during our darkest evenings are often the very messengers sent to remind us that our story is far from over, carrying blessings wrapped in hardship that we could never have anticipated on our own. When we choose to replace fear with hospitality and bitterness with an open heart, we create a space where beauty can rise out of old ashes, where lost joy can be restored 100-fold, and where a home once defined by silence can finally sing with life once again.